Today we'll be continuing our study of the priestly literature. We're going to be studying the book of Leviticus in particular, but we're going to focus on the themes of priests and sacrifice. So who are priests? What do they do? What are their jobs? How do they do these things that they're in charge of, the sacrifices and the festivals and so on? So we'll talk about those issues, and we'll focus first on the issue of sacrifice, which we left a cliffhanger at the end of last time, and the question was, why is blood so important in ancient Israelite religion? Just to resituate us again, though, we're talking about the priestly literature. Just to remind us that the priestly literature, the priestly source, right, of the Pentateuch, and we can see priestly interests throughout the Bible, but the priestly source, we would say, is limited to the Pentateuch, and really limited to just parts of Genesis, little bits of Exodus until you get to chapter 25. Chapter 25 through 40 is mostly P. Leviticus is mostly P, and some of Numbers, but then none of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is its own source, right? The D source. So we're talking really about this very particular perspective on ancient Israelite history from the perspective of the priestly authors. And we think these priestly authors were in Jerusalem. They probably used and collated and interpreted sources that were previous to them, but they filtered those through their lens, which was the lens of priests working at the central temple in Jerusalem, and who had been displaced. Right, we think that they started to write these things down, or at least edit them together and create their source, their written source, sometime during the exile. So they were bringing with them traditions from the temple, which had been destroyed. And after the temple was destroyed, they were worried. They probably taught the following generations of priests just by oral teachings, but also probably by just the repetition of being in the temple and a part of it. But once the temple was gone, you couldn't teach people through osmosis like that, right? You couldn't teach them by apprenticeship, by them watching you and so on. So they were probably very worried that they would lose the information that is now recorded in Leviticus, which is basically a priestly manual. Leviticus wasn't originally intended for you to read. It was intended for the priests, and for the priests to be able to read parts of it to people at certain particular times. Of course, over time, it became part of the sacred Pentateuch and so on, and it shifted in terms of its intended audience. But if we think about it in the world behind the text kind of way, we can think about it as really intended for priests in training. So we'll talk a little bit about who those folks are. But remember, we're talking about the kind of symbolic world of these priests, and we can interpret all of this interesting material in theological ways if we understand this world in which they inhabited. And certain anthropologists, people who study human cultures, people like Mary Douglas was one of the first to really take seriously the idea of taboos in cultures and not just think that they were relics of some primitive past or something, but that all human beings, including modern human beings who think of themselves as very advanced and so on technologically, and we don't have any silly rituals like that or silly taboos, or we don't have a symbolic world. Of course we do. Mary Douglas points out the deep connections between ancient ideas about ritual impurity and modern conceptions of taboos or things that are impure and things like that. So in any event, you can see that there are in our world, especially in the Christian world, like we've inherited a lot of these ideas, even if we think, oh, that's Old Testament stuff, we don't need that. So just to remind us that we're talking about this priestly symbolic world, which means that certain elements of the world, like blood, take on a special meaning, and certain categories of things, certain types of animals that are unclean, right? They take on special meaning, even if you wouldn't be able to notice that if you weren't a part of this symbolic world. And remember that the central element, the central theological problem of the priestly world is the problem of divine presence. We want God to be near us, but at the same time, it's dangerous to have God near us. So this theology of divine presence is really a way to manage and to mediate God to the community in a way that protects the community, but also that allows them access to God's power, God's saving power. So, in any event, remember we talked about holy and common, and we talked about pure and impure, and moral impurity and moral purity, and then ritual purity and ritual impurity, and so on. We talked about holy spaces and holy people, holy times, and so on. We'll talk a little bit more about those today as well. We talked about rituals and how they are ways to enact God's presence in the world. We talked about sacramental mentality, this idea that there are certain things we can do that make God more present, or at least make us more aware of God's presence. And those times are times where things can happen, things can change. So baptism is a Christian sacrament where something happens when you pour the water in. We argue, of course, different Christians about what exactly happens, but something happens, right? So in the ancient world, there were these moments that produced chances for something to happen. When God entered the world in a special way. Sacrifice being the main one of these rituals, but we'll talk about a few more today. So we talked about Nadab and Abihu, right? Remember Leviticus, this is Leviticus chapter 10, the story of the death of Nadab and Abihu, which is really a warning to all future priests that take this stuff seriously. Don't mess around with it, because it's an honor and a blessing in many ways to be a priest, but also it's a great burden as well. We talked about holy spaces, and what we're going to focus on now is what is happening with this altar. So remember the altar, there's 3 altars in the sanctuary, the Mishkan, the tabernacle, right, that moves around the wilderness, and the temple. Remember the Mishkan, the mobile sanctuary, is kind of a picture of the temple, a little miniature of it that can move. We have here this altar out here. Now notice the grates, right? There's grates and there's like coals underneath the grates, hot coals all under here. So it's a fire in there, and you could put the meat. Well, you are told to put the meat on top of the grate and cook it. And remember, this creates a meal for the people, for the priests, reconciliation meal, and so on. But also there is horns of the altar. 4 horned altars, and these are really important and sacred parts of the altar, which seem to collect in a way the sins of the people. Remember, we talked about here's another just image of the holy space of the temple. Remember, we talked about how they kind of get attached in a way to the altar, and then there's blood that is put on the altar, and something happens there. We talked about how there's different levels of like where sins attach to, right? So these involuntary or things that you confess and recognize and try to make right, these kinds of individual sins would attach to that big altar in the courtyard. Those are the ones that most of the people would come and offer sacrifices for. You would put your hand on the lamb and so on and say, this is my sin that I'm atoning for. And then you'd have the feast afterwards. Inside the sanctuary, there's an altar, the incense altar, that only the priests can go to. It's more sacred. It's in God's house, right? And these are involuntary but communal sins. So if the people repent of something and realize that they've done something wrong, then they can atone for it there. And then brazen and unrepented offenses, these terrible things that people do that they don't feel sorry for, or they don't want to apologize for. Those things stick into God's bedroom. And this is the trash that really builds up and can make God very upset. And this can be handled one day a year, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So, what is it about the blood? Let me just walk you through one of these. Let's look at Leviticus chapter 4, the sin offerings, or as Jacob Milgram, a great scholar of the book of Leviticus. He's written huge commentaries on it. There's a joke that Jacob Milgram knows more about Leviticus than God does. But in any event, these the sin offerings are also understood to be purification offerings. This word can describe both sin and the thing that purifies from sin, or that is some way cleans these horns of the altar. And so here's what happens. By the way, chapter 4 is organized kind of in terms of social hierarchy. There's stuff about the kings first. The idea is that if kings do something bad, it affects a whole lot of people. So there's a kind of and kings have a lot of resources, so they're supposed to bring more things. They bring a big bowl or something. And, if there's an anointed priest who sins, this is a really bad thing, right? Priests need to bring a bigger animal to atone for their sins and so on. If the whole congregation, in verse 13, if the whole congregation sins, then the elders need to come and kind of take responsibility for this thing, right? Verse 22, when a ruler sins, again, a big thing. So anointed priest, the whole body of the people, then the ruler, and then verse 27, this is your part and my part. If any one of the ordinary people among you sins unintentionally, now some of you are likely ordained and some of you are not purely an ordinary person, but nonetheless, just for our sake here, if one of the ordinary people among you sins unintentionally in doing one of the things that by the Lord's commandments ought not be done and incurs guilt, when the sin that you have committed is made known to you, you shall bring a female goat without blemish as your offering for the sin that you have committed. So you have to bring an animal, and then you lay your hand on the head of the sin offering, and the sin offering or the purification offering shall be slaughtered at the place of the burnt offering. So this is saying you. So this is probably something that a priest would read to someone who is trying to atone for their sin. So you show up, you being a regular common person in Israel, you show up to the temple and you say, hey, I sinned. What am I going to do? The priest starts to read this to you, right? You shall bring a female goat to blemish. So verse 29, you shall lay your hand on the head of the sin offering. Now the temple would have been a very loud, confusing place. Lots of people in there, lots of people wandering around. This is a way for you to claim, hey, this is, in sight of God and the priest and the people who you have harmed. In chapter 5, it seems clear that the other people who you've harmed are there. They have to be there, right? Someone who's let you know that you've sinned. That's probably someone you've hurt. So you come there with them. You lay your hand on the goat and you say, hey, God, priest, fellow community member who I've sinned against, or family member or something, this is mine. I claim this. I take responsibility for this. This is my animal. And then the priest likely slaughters it. It shall be slaughtered, probably, and then or maybe the person does it. It's unclear here. But then verse 30, the priest shall take some of its blood. So the person, the common person who's atoning, you can't touch the blood. In Genesis chapter 9, remember there's the covenant of blood with Noah and all the people of the world. And God says, don't mess with the blood. You can eat meat, but don't mess with the blood. Blood has the sacred life in it. And now, in fact, let's just go ahead and read that just to remind us. In Genesis 9, this covenant, after the flood of Noah, when God is making rules. Remember, the covenant was part of the priestly part of the Noah story. It was kind of the solution to the problem. So in chapter 9 of Genesis, verse 4, only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is its blood. So blood is the life force that God has put in us according to the priestly source. It symbolizes our life and the life of all animals, God's life, right? If God is the God of life, then this is the central kind of motor that is running our body. For your own lifeblood, I will surely require a reckoning. From every animal, I will require it. From human beings, each one for the blood of another. So you have to do something to reckon for, to make up for spilling blood. It's like an equation. You have to balance it out in the end. I will require a reckoning for human life. So, whoever sheds the blood of a human, by human that person's blood shall be shed. This idea is based on what comes next. For in God's own image, God made humankind. It harkens back to Genesis 1. The idea is that people are important. And in here, it also says that animals are important. All life is important. But here it focuses on humans and says humans are made in God's image. You can't kill them willy-nilly, right? You can't kill them and not expect God to demand some kind of recompense. And that recompense, the recompense for sin is the blood of animals. So it seems like it might not make sense, but we'll get to it in a minute. So if you go back to to Leviticus chapter 4, verse 30, the priest takes some of the blood. So the blood is important of this animal, and only the priest can touch it. The priest takes the blood with his finger and puts it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering, all the horns. So the priest is like washing or like rubbing the horns of the altar with the blood of the animal. And then the priest takes the blood and kind of dashes it against the base of the altar and kind of cleans the whole altar with it. And then you cook the animal, and then God likes the smell, right? God doesn't eat the food, God likes the smell, and thus the priest shall make atonement on your behalf, and you shall be forgiven. So in the Day of Atonement in Yom Kippur is a really important day in the Jewish calendar today, but there were atonements that were made all the time in ancient Israel. The Day of Atonement is a very particular one that we'll get to in a moment. So you can see this, right? And by the way, there's other animals that you can bring in order to make up for this. In chapter 5, it makes clear, and through chapter 7, makes very clear that if you're very poor and you can't afford a sheep like this or a goat, then you can bring birds. And if you remember in Luke, Jesus' parents bring birds to the altar, which means that they were very, very poor. So there were different levels. There were accommodations made for people who couldn't afford certain kinds of animals, just to recognize that in ancient Israel there was a distinction among kind of different economic classes, but also there were accommodations made and certain privileges given. When we get to Deuteronomy, we'll talk a little bit about what provisions were made, social and economic legal provisions were made for people who were destitute or poor. But just to notice, Leviticus mentions this too. So if we think of this whole ritual happening, right, what is happening here? The priests are taking the blood and rubbing the whole altar, especially the horns, with their hands, right? They're like kind of scrubbing this altar. It would have been very dirty. There would have been blood all over the place. It's caked with blood, right? I mean, it's not clean, but the idea is that you're purifying moral impurities that have attached themselves to the altar. The most important part of all of this is just the concept that the power of blood, the power of God's life that is in the blood, is somehow a ritual detergent. It can clean away and purify moral impurities and sins. And remember, they're cleaning the altar. You don't get touched by the blood, according to the priestly source. The sins have attached to the altar in God's house. Remember the lightning rod analogy, the sins attach. So just to see that this is what's happening in these rituals. They seem boring and strange and weird, but it's a really important theological point that's being made, that God is trying to do something here for you, right? And if you look at chapter 5, this is another section about offerings, so like in verse 14 of chapter 5, the Lord said to Moses, saying, when any of you commit a trespass and sin unintentionally, you shall bring as your gift offering. This is kind of repeating some of this stuff, this restitution offering. So there's a bit of unclarity about where some of these things begin and end, and we might have multiple rituals for certain kinds of things. But it does seem really clear to me, at least, that this was kind of a single ritual, and we have different parts of it described in different ways. But notice that in chapter 6, if you sin and take something from your neighbor or something like this, or verse 3, if you've found something lost and lied about it, or you swear falsely. So if you do anything that harms someone else in the community. Verse 4, when you have sinned and realized your guilt, and would restore what you took by robbery or fraud, or the deposit that was committed to you, or the lost thing that you found, or anything else that you've sworn about falsely. So if you have to restore the stuff first, the beginning of the reconciliation ritual is to actually repair what you have broken, to make reparations, right? You shall repay the principal amount and shall add 1/5 to it. That is, you have to actually give interest, right? So then you shall pay it to the owner when you realize your guilt, so you give it to the owner. So giving back to the person that you've harmed is the beginning of this process. And then you shall bring to the priest as your guilt offering to the Lord a ram without blemish from the flock. And then the priest shall make atonement, that is, clean the altar on your behalf before the Lord, and you shall be forgiven for any of the things that one may do and incur guilt thereby. This is like I said, a complicated thing to kind of reconstruct in certain ways, but it seems pretty clear, the outlines of what was happening. Now, this seems actually very similar in some ways to other ancient Near Eastern rituals, but also different. So for us to understand what this means in ancient Israel, it helps us to compare it to other ancient Near Eastern practices. And that's why we ask you to read Hidden Riches. Now, I won't go through all of this. There's a lot in here, and it's a rich, rich text. There's a lot for us to learn, to think about, and to chew on here. But just take a look at this. So page 147 in Hidden Riches, the beginning of the ritual texts section. Christopher Hayes asks you to read Leviticus 16. We'll walk through that in just a moment together here. But he starts with Ashela's ritual against a plague in the army. This is an ancient Hittite ritual. The Hittites were folks who died out really in the Bronze Age collapse. So just before Israel emerges as a people, they were very important. They continue on as a much weakened society. So you'll hear about Hittites kind of wandering around in the Bible. They're sometimes called Neo-Hittites. But in any event, this Hittite culture was very similar to the culture of ancient Israel in many ways. And we see here a couple of different rituals, actually, that have to do with sacrifice. This is, by the way, a Hittite temple. And you can see it's got three parts. It's got the courtyard, then it's got the sanctuary, and then it's got the Holy of Holies. And it's got a big standing stone in the back to represent the god. So, I mean, it's very, very, very similar to a lot of ancient Israelite practice. But so this is a ritual for an army that's wandering around in the wilderness. They're going on a campaign, right? And when you go through the wilderness, you find weird gods. This also should influence the way we see Exodus 3, right? Moses is walking in the wilderness and stumbles upon a strange god. Right? This would have been terrifying, right? Because the kinds of gods that live in cities are understood to be good gods. You know, high gods, powerful gods, gods that like order, structure, hierarchy, right? But the gods that live in the wilderness, they're often understood to be demons. Demons doesn't mean evil purely in the ancient world. A demon just means a god that doesn't live by the rules, a god that is out for that own god's self. These demons sometimes tricked people, sometimes tried to destabilize other major cultures, but also sometimes just kind of did mean things because they made them laugh. You know, think about like Loki in the Thor myths, sometimes good, sometimes bad, out for themselves, really. So all to say that when you're out in the wilderness, it's a dangerous place, and you got to figure out what to do. So these Hittites, the Hittite armies, they, especially if disease comes, which was a sign of plague by a demon. Notice also what happens in Exodus, right? All the plagues. So in any event, the Pharaoh would have thought Yahweh was a demon. That's what I'm saying. If Pharaoh had a word for Yahweh, it would have been a plague demon, a wilderness plague demon. We know that's not what Yahweh was, but just to say, from the perspective of Pharaoh, they were messing around with some really weird stuff. You can see this in chapter 5 when Pharaoh rejects Moses and says, well, we need to go out in the wilderness to worship a deity who's going to give you plagues if you don't go. In any event, there's an epidemic that occurs in the land or in an army camp. I perform this ritual. So here's, again, a ritual manual for priests in the ancient Hittite culture to learn. So you take these rams, right, and then you try to give the rams, right, to the deity. And so you give these live rams to the deity. And whatever deity has caused this plague, for you I have secured these rams. Be satisfied with these. You kind of say something like, hey, eat these and don't eat me. The idea was that plagues were gods killing you so they could eat you, or demons, demon gods, killing you so they could eat you. So you send them out. But then they also send out a woman. If the idea was that this is what the Hittite priest believes, well, maybe the god is just hungry for people flesh, right? So we'll just send a slave woman out there, right? So you can see the hierarchy in these ancient societies, also the disregard for basic human life, but also the kind of hierarchy of both gender and this economic status of oppression in slavery and cultural oppression. So you can send out this woman with beer and bread. Now, one thing to think about this woman is that she is a slave to an army. I don't know if you know the culture of women who are enslaved and given to the use of armies, but these women are not treated well. And this woman gets sent out away with a big thing of beer and 3 loaves of bread. This might have been a terrible thing for her. It also might have been a way for her to escape with some provisions. So in any event, but the soldiers think they're sending her out into the wilderness to be eaten by demons who might prefer human flesh. Then they also set out a big a feast, right, with beer and meat and so on. This is at paragraph 5, about halfway down the page. So then you cook food and you lay out a big feast. Maybe these are demons that like cooked food. So you send out a few different types of of food for these demons to satiate them no matter how they want to be satiated. And you try to get them to eat it to leave you alone. Now notice that's the basic idea is that gods need food and that they will mess with you to get their food. There's another ritual here. There's a bunch that are interesting and important. But day 5 of the Babylonian Akitu festival is another really important one for us to understand ancient Near Eastern rituals. So it starts on the bottom of page 149. Really, it starts on page 150. I guess the ceremony itself. But if you read this carefully, and if you didn't, pause it and read through this. It's hard to understand, but just try, because I'm going to ruin it for you. If you figure it out yourself, it's pretty cool. Okay, so you've read it. All right. What happens here? So this is a New Year's festival in which the Enuma Elish was read every year, the creation story. And the king would get up there with the high priest, and the high priest would slap the king until he cried. Some people would love to bring back this ritual, but this ritual was really for the newborn earth, right? Every year, the idea was that the gods continued to kind of recreate the earth on New Year's Day, and they didn't want the king to think that he was in charge of the whole earth, really. So they would ritually humiliate him just that one day. But also they had to do some other stuff to get ready, right? So they would do these sacrifices. They would get an exorcist to purify the temple. That's in line 340 on page 150. So this exorcist would purify the temple. The idea is they're demons that try to get into the temple. So you want to get them out, right? And so there's a particular kind of priest that's good at this kind of thing. And he will, in line 353, near the bottom of the page, he will call a slaughterer. This is a ritual priest who would be good at and trained in manipulating animal blood, who will cut off the head of the sheep, and the exorcist will purify the temple with the body of the sheep. So purifying the temple requires blood in Babylon too. So it's just like Israel, right? But let's keep reading. So the exorcist then, on top of page 151, will lift up the body of the sheep and go to the river and put the body and the sheep in the river. And what are they really doing, right? They're kind of taking the body of the sheep and then they're putting it all over the temple, and then they're getting rid of the body of the sheep after a while. And then they purify the temple. And then verse 380, you can see down there near the bottom, Ningrim, who casts the spell, whatever evil is in the temple, get out. Great demon, may Bel kill you. May he expel you. And the craftsmen go out to the gate, and so on. So this is, and the king getting hit in the face is in page 153 if you want to see that part. Okay, so let's just relive this for a moment. There are demons trying to get into the temple, and the demons are the things that cause the bad stuff in the ancient Near East. So they're going to try to take the animal blood and get rid of the demons by taking the spattering blood of these sheep all over the temple, and then they cook the food and give it to the gods, right? So in the ancient Near East, food, the slaughter is really for the gods, and the blood has power, but it has power to get rid of demons. So one way of thinking about this is that in ancient Babylon, the real problem is kind of divine instability, these demons that are getting in the middle of the way. Obviously, people think that they do some bad things, but the real ritual power is to get rid of demons who might be trying to get you. Now, notice in Leviticus, notice in the whole Old Testament, there isn't a whole lot about demons. There's a little thing about the Azazel in Yom Kippur, but it's not focused on what Azazel is and who Azazel is. The Bible doesn't even care to tell you. It doesn't give you any information about it. And there's very few references to any bad spirits or demons. There's other gods who are said to not exist. I just want to be very clear here that Leviticus does not say that demons are the problem that cause the problems in your life and in your community and in the world and in nature, right, in the environment. Humans are responsible for the problems in Leviticus. When you go to the temple, the blood takes care of your problems that you have caused and our problems that we have caused. It handles individual and communal sin. It does not scare away demons. The important thing to notice here is that it's about trying to establish individual and communal responsibility and to give us rituals to try to deal with and reconcile and really repair the problems that we have caused and that we have inherited from previous generations as well. That's a part of the priestly work. So instead of blaming all our problems on some sort of evil power, which gets us off the hook, right? Leviticus is trying to get us to realize that we are culpable for a lot of the problems in our world, and others are culpable for them too, and we together are culpable, and the previous generations are culpable. But to claim that, to name that, to deal with it, to have real material responses to it, and to have ceremonies and rituals that help us to reconcile with one another. This, I think, is a really important theological point that we really only understand by comparing it to the ancient world, but also to reading very closely this whole symbolic world of P and trying to put all these pieces together. Because the priestly source doesn't explain all these things very well because they expected that you already understood it, right? I mean, many of the things that happen in our world we don't explain very fully when we communicate with one another because I don't have to explain Zoom every single time we get on Zoom. But if some future historian finds only scattered sources from our time period and hears a lot about Zoom but doesn't find the manual to Zoom, it'd be hard for them to understand what it is. So Leviticus gives us this manual, but it doesn't explain all of the symbolic parts of it. So if we put these together and in comparison to ancient world texts, I think it gives us a theology that helps us understand why Jesus' blood is so important to the New Testament. You'll talk about this a lot more in New Testament class, but just to say, why is blood so... So the author of Hebrews is really dealing carefully with the priestly theology of ancient Israel. And no place in the New Testament says that this whole theology has disappeared or vanished or it was stupid, we did away with it, God never liked it in the first place. The New Testament takes for granted that the temple was important, that this blood sacrifice was actually crucial to our relationship with God, but that now it's been handled in a different way. By the way, Jewish people today, modern Jews, they don't have the temple in Jerusalem. Most Jews actually aren't yearning to build the temple again in more than a symbolic way. They'll talk about it, next year in Jerusalem and so on. But it's not actually in the plans for most people, most Jews today. Instead, what happened was in the early period after the destruction of the temple, there was a theology that the prayers of the people gathered together in the synagogue, a house of prayer and study of Scripture, those substituted for the sacrifices in the temple. And so Jews today meet twice a day in prayer. You have to get a certain number of people together, a kind of base number of people together to have these prayers. But you pray morning and evening, and then in the Sabbath there's extra services and so on, and they're reading and study of Scripture and so on. But these substitute for the sacrifices in the temple. So all to say that Christians and Jews today have kind of moved beyond this theology in some ways, but both of them also, implicitly at least, our current practices are based on the idea of this sacrifice. The Eucharist is based on the idea of Leviticus. So if you ever hear someone say, hey, Leviticus stinks, I hate it, let's just cut it out of the Bible, you say, you can't understand the New Testament without Leviticus. Or at least that's what I hope you say. When we come back to our next video, we're going to talk about different types of rituals and the days and the times that they would occur. And we'll also talk a little bit more about what kind of priests existed and who became priests. And could you ever not be a priest if you were chosen to be one? Okay, we'll get back to that next time.